Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. A husband was talking with his doctor, inquiring about his wife's COVID vaccine status. The doctor replied that his wife's status was personal medical information and he wasn't permitted to divulge it. So the husband took his wife to a restaurant instead to find out. This is the world of contradictions in which we live. Vaccine mandates have been established in nearly all jurisdictions in Canada, from airports to restaurants to even your local hockey league. You aren't going to access many places and events unless you divulge your COVID jab status. And now, in many workplaces, employees are being compelled to divulge their status to their employers. Failing to do so could result in rapid testing, suspension, and even termination. But is this legal? Is it fair? Should you be compelled to share your personal health care information with the local bartender or your kid's hockey coach or even your boss? And central to the question in discussion is what happens to our charter-enshrined privacy rights? What is the state of those rights in the context of COVID, when we are being asked to upload private medical information to an app, or when private medical information becomes a daily discussion topic? Now, to help us address these concerns, we are joined by Michelle Simard, Senior Legal Counselor and Privacy Officer, and Charitarth Bharti, a lawyer and policy professional focusing on technology law. Thank you both for joining me today. It should be a very interesting discussion.
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Great, thank you so much. So, Michelle, perhaps I'll start with you. What does our privacy right entail in Canada? What does our right to privacy entail?
Well, it entails a lot of things. It really depends on what aspect of privacy. So given your context that you said in regards to medical stuff, I mean, our medical information can be given out if we choose to give it out freely. But then if we don't choose to give it out, then it should be protected. And it's protected in Ontario specifically by PHIPAA. That's the acronym for the Personal Health Information Privacy Act within Ontario. And within that act, it sets out who are the people, such as a health information custodian. In the privacy world, we just call them HICs, for that's the acronym. And then we have agents who are sometimes the administrative staff, for instance, in a doctor's office, the receptionist or the administrative assistant, who then processes your information, and they could be agents. And those people, so the HICs and also the agents, they all handle your medical information. And at the end of the day, if somebody comes in and asks for it, they can't have it because you have to either sign an authorization and direction to allow someone to have it. So we do have these prescribed mechanisms in place to protect everyone's privacy. The question is it being done correctly? Do we have a good enforcement model? We don't. And in the context of what you said, asking restaurants to do this, there needs to be some form of legislative act that will require that.
Right. And Charitarth, to me, this seems unprecedented. I don't recall a time when one has to divulge their medical status to access a place or even access basic services. I understand that children, when they enter school, are asked to produce a vaccine record, a record of vaccination. There's also conscientious objections, or those for conscious reasons or medical or religious reasons can opt out of that. But I don't recall this ever being the case. So I guess I would ask then, has something changed with privacy rights in Canada? Why now?
That's an interesting question, Tanya. Primarily, like the way we look at privacy is in the lens of a transaction between two people. Like if I want to have my data shared with somebody and in return I get a service, or it's basically being used to provide me a service and to improve the level of service. That's the transaction that you generally have with somebody. And that's generally outlined in a privacy policy that you usually have with that service provider. In this scenario, it goes beyond that, and there's an element of public law which intersects with this usually private transaction. The way this works in the sense is that there's public rights involved. So if you're in a restaurant, right, and if you have to be unmasked there, which you will have to be if you're eating in the restaurant, you'll end up impacting more than just yourself and your bodily rights. So that's primarily the idea that the governments are running with. But there is an inherent disconnect, which we are seeing. It's a trust issue. A lot of people don't see their rights being adequately protected within the legal regime that Canada currently provides. And not just Canada, several other countries.
Okay, I'm going to pause you right there. We've got to go to commercial, but we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion on privacy rights in the time of COVID. And joining me is Michelle Simard and Charitarth Bharti. Thank you again both for joining me. We know that Canadians, and again, I think this is unprecedented, are being asked by their employers, be it if it's the hospital, healthcare setting, maybe a law firm, maybe their teaching supervisor, could be even a clergyman. They're being asked by their employers to divulge their private medical information, in this case, their vaccine status. Does one have an obligation to disclose whatever an employer asks? Michelle, do you want to take that?
Well, I don't know if I would classify that as an obligation. I mean, in a private setting, in a private business, I would say, if your employer wants you to wear a uniform and you got hired for that job, then you would wear a uniform, regardless of other places don't require you to wear a uniform. When it comes to private businesses, I think there's a lot of ownership on what they want to do. I think the major issue for me is public employees. Those that work for government institutions, where then it's with taxpayers' dollars and the government is mandating them to have these vaccinations and show proof of it. And that, I think, is a problem, because then it's not an obligation. It becomes mandatory. Otherwise, you can lose your job.
But why should that be different or more concerning than a private organization that does the same thing?
Because a private organization, it's like I just said, with the uniform, a private organization can choose certain things that they want to do with their business, right? If they want you to wear a certain outfit, or if they want you to have your hair up in a certain way, so long it's not infringing on any human rights, then it's fine to do so if an employer asks you to do so, right? If they ask you to wear a costume and you're supposed to wear this all day, and that's fine. But when it comes to a public institution where it's taxpayers' dollars and they're mandating this, and they also mandate that you have to show proof of it, I think that becomes just a little bit more, it goes down to the weeds, and it's just like, what's the justification? And if the justification is still good and warranted, then you're going to have to do something legislatively to ask for that, because the consequence then is, if you don't produce it, which everyone has absolutely entitled to do, so they can say, no, I do not want to share that information. It's none of your business. I don't want to. And if the alternative for them not sharing the information is, well, you've lost your job now, well, then I would argue, then we're going to have a lot of lawsuits on our hand. And I look forward to all the employment and labor lawyers who are going to go out there and fight for us and set the boundaries, because I believe right now what's happening is boundaries aren't being set. And I think what's happening is the government is pushing over the boundaries to see how far they can go. Mm-hmm. And what we need right now is we need the limits to be placed. We need to set that box where it's like, this is it, and this is as far as you can go. And if you do this, then there are consequences to the government for doing it.
I think that's a very interesting point. And just for our viewers' perspective, again, this is not about vaccinated or unvaccinated. It's the disclosure of personal information, personal medical information. There are many, many folks who've received both shots and just simply don't want to disclose this private information to their employer. And that leads me to another question, which is, when we're talking about disclosing personal medical information to an employer or to the restaurant, are we setting a bad precedent legally? Charitarth, do you want to take that one?
Right. So generally, in terms of how we set about a task, and it generally looks like something that's conceivable within the scope of the law. And eventually the use cases tend to get worse, and there's more and more encroachment into the territory of what would traditionally be my right to do something or not to do something. That's generally how we categorize mission creep, right? So you start with something that sounds completely innocuous, right? But eventually it gets more and more nefarious as time passes by. So yes, that could be the starting of something bad. We can only tell, over the course of time. But at the moment, to fully open up, I think the economic imperative is really taking over at the moment, right? So just to fully open up and get back to offices, most employers, most governments are squarely and singularly focused on that. So with that, they're kind of brushing aside what they at times deem to be menial concerns in the face of the larger concern, which is public health.
It's a very good point that, again, most people are complying with all these infringements, if you will, because we want to get back on track, open things up, et cetera. In the 30 seconds we have left before commercial, Charitarth, I'll let you take this. But at what point does the government have to justify why we're doing these infringements? At what point are we demanding justification? 20 seconds.
I think the only point that we'll demand explanations at this point is when we have loss of livelihoods. I think that's where we will have the last straw and the hard stop. And the government's looking at the larger electoral imperative, which it's focused with and it's burdened by.
Michelle, in the break, you and I were discussing health cards, and we brought up an interesting point, or you brought up an interesting point, where we generally are told, you cannot use your health card as identification. I always just assumed it was because your address wasn't on the ID, but you're suggesting it's something completely unrelated.
Oh, absolutely. It has nothing to do with your address. It has to do with the fact that your health card number's there, and you are disclosing medical health information. And that's an insurance that our government pays for when you get healthcare. And the last thing they want is to have people who don't and do not qualify for OHIP in our province to access that. And so that's why it cannot be required as a form of valid ID. So I do find it interesting that the government mandates that it is not a form of valid ID, and all the businesses adhere to that. Yet at this particular junction, it's okay to then ask for your vaccine passport. And I find that equally strange, because if people do show that on that little slip that shows that you do have your vaccine, it actually does have your health card number on it.
My goodness.
So there is the irony I find in all of that. That's why I kept saying to you, let's see how far these boundaries are going to expand and who's going to do something about that. Because in order to have a lawsuit, you have to have damages. So let's see what happens.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of these damages. Charitarth, I'm sure you've been following the news within the first few days or maybe a week of the rollout of many of these vaccine passports across Canada. We have seen security breaches. For example, the Canadian vaccine app PortPass, it stopped registering new users and ordered security audits because allegedly members of the public were able to see personal data of users online, including their ID. In Saskatchewan, for example, QR codes, those are those little digital codes that the smartphones can read. They were temporarily removed after a privacy breach. And I'm reading here, one person's data was inadvertently shared with the QR codes of 3 other people. I'm concerned. If I upload a healthcare status or a vaccine status to an app, how secure are these things, and what is the requirement for security on these kinds of third-party apps?
Right, Tanya, you've hit the nail on the head with this point. So basically, one of the areas where we're lacking any sort of enforcement or any foresight in terms of what the privacy issues could be is public-private partnerships. So PortPass, you mentioned, right? PortPass had, it's a private app. It had just, it took the opportunity to fill the vacuum of not having those handheld devices where you could just, of having apps on your handheld devices that you could use to show your vaccine status. But eventually, and this is one of the problems that we're going to face more and more, that we're not prepared for this and the government isn't coming with the right tools. So obviously the private sector being more proactive is going to fill in that gap. But we need to have some sort of regulation. We need to have some sort of preparedness in terms of what areas we tend to have this sort of a dialogue with the private sector. And in PortPass's case, it's been shocking for all of us in the industry as to how so many people's data was just leaked out, and they did not know for the longest time that this was available to everybody, for everybody to access. And this only came out, when a big game was on the horizon, and they at the very last minute, they basically end up telling you find another way to prove your vaccination status. So it's a problem. The government needs to definitely step in and look into this. And another example, perhaps if I have the time to point out, would be one of Philly fighting COVID. This happened in the US, our neighbor down south, where another public-private partnership went down south. So these are areas where we need to have some sort of ethical boundaries set in, because the profit motive versus the public health motive don't often coincide.
So rather than, to me, I mean, if I were the government, rather than rushing into something that is so sensitive as where people are uploading their personal medical and their personal ID, wouldn't we get this right before we launch the program? 30 seconds.
Okay, so to make it really quickly, I'm going to summarize it on very simple terms because we got 30, now 25 seconds. But at the end of the day, you can choose to travel. You can choose to go to a restaurant. You can choose to go to a carnival. You're not required to do it. And it's not part of your livelihood, and it's not a guaranteed right. So if a private business, going back to what we first talked about, wants to have these certain rules because it's their private business, they want to have it, they're absolutely entitled to do so. But when it comes to a public institution, or when it comes to you losing your job through a public institution, mandating these things and asking you to disclose your personal health information without any type of legislative reason or foundational reason for it, then that's where I say we have these huge problems. And just to all your viewers, hell no. Do never give your upload your thing into an app, because at the end of the day, you don't know who's monitoring it. You don't know any cybersecurity that they have.
Okay, we'll be right back. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on privacy rights and what you might or might not be doing with respect to your vaccine status and your personal medical information. Michelle, just before we went to break, you had issued actually a very stern warning. You said, do not upload your information to an app. Why are you so strong about it? Like, what's the problem? Be very clear for our viewers.
Well, because it's just like everything else, caveat emptor, buyer beware. You don't know anything about that app. You don't know the background. You don't know who's controlling it. You don't know if they're actually following regulations. You have no idea what country it's from and who's monitoring in what country. You have no idea if that country has rules. You don't know if this particular, even if this is in this country, that whoever the people who are analyzing this data are putting it together and collecting it, where they're storing. Cybersecurity is a whole other massive, massive department. And at the end of the day, you're uploading your stuff to an app that could be rushed. Who's running it? Are they following the rules? Is there a compliance department? Is it associated with it? There's so many things that can run amok. And in a previous privacy episode, I talked a little bit about the deep dark web. And I can tell you right now, a health card number and someone's full name and their age and date of birth is worth a ridiculous amount. People will pay up to $10,000 in the deep dark web for that information. And why? Because it is such valuable information for them to use and sell. And so at the end of the day, that information should always be kept private. And if they're not giving you safeguards about your personal health information, which could be used for many different reasons, I would argue saying, why should I give it? And I think if everything is always changed by consumer demand. If we don't like something, we can push back as a group. But if we don't, and we just accept it complacently until something goes wrong or someone had a bad issue or incident, only then do we cry wolf and say, oh my God. But why should we do that? Why can't we just be very smart, educated, and well-informed citizens who sit there and say, I'm not sure and I don't want to do that? And if the government mandates it,
let me ask you another question, though. Some people will say, but the government has this information already. They already have a database with all of my health card information. If you went to get the vaccine, some pharmacist or some vaccine clinic took your health card, printed out your certificate. They've obviously inputted not only just that you were vaccinated, but your dose, what number it was, the vial number, et cetera. So is the information not out there already?
No, it isn't. Because again, going back to PHIPAA, the Personal Health Information Privacy Act, you can't share that information. Like I mentioned, the HICs, the health information custodians, and the agents, you have to be prescribed under one of those categories. So like it's section 17.2 within PHIPAA, you have to be prescribed as that particular custodian or agent in order to handle health information. And if you are not, if you don't fall under that legislative provision, then you're not allowed to handle health information. So other government organizations cannot have access to your medical records. So for instance, our Ministry of Transportation, while there are some health issues there because some people need to wear eyeglasses, right? And they can't drive their vehicle without the help. And that could be medical, but they don't have access to your medical records. You have to sign something to allow them to have access. So we do have walls and barriers within our government that don't allow the sharing of information because it's mandated by our regulations. However, if we found out that somehow a different government employee within a different department had access to it and they're not in the legislative act as either a custodian or agent, then there could be some issues and you could sue for damages. So at that point, yeah, it's not out there for everybody. It's very strict and mandated where it can go.
Okay, we only have about a minute left. Charitarth, given what Michelle has shared and many privacy concerns on Canadian minds with respect to vaccine information or healthcare information in general, will the government will there be an opportunity to have like a paper versus an uploaded digital pass, a paper pass for those who do want to travel and have been vaccinated and want to take advantage of this, of what I would call a new two-tier system? Will there be a non-digital pass? 20 seconds.
Right. So basically, this is something that the government would have to do, in my opinion, because not everybody is coming along with the digital revolution and as quick as the government would like. So the government has to take every last citizen into account and has to take every last right of that citizen into account. So when they bring up a digital passport, which they intend to, they have to factor in that there might be people who might not be tech savvy to deal with all of that.
Right, right. Okay, well, I guess we're going to have to keep our eye on this file as it develops. Thank you both so very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Many Canadians want to comply with these new measures because they want to be safe healthcare-wise. But is uploading your information going to open you up to more risks, cybersecurity ones? We have to think about that. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.